A dog blocks the police's path, and the reason for its action will make you cry. It was a cold night in Paris, and the night patrol were driving slowly through the empty streets, with the light from street lamps casting long and disturbing shadows. Sitting in the police car, Louise was staring absently at the empty sidewalks, so she suddenly noticed a skinny brown dog with a slightly ruffled coat standing right in the middle of the road. He didn't seem scared, but rather, he stared intently at the police. His eyes were filled with a sense of urgency that was hard to ignore. Arnaud, Louise's teammate, braked sharply, surprised by what the dog was doing. "What is he doing here?" Arnaud whispered, puzzled. Louise felt something special in that dog's intense gaze, as if it was trying to convey an uncertain message. "Curious," she whispered, "we should follow him. I think he needs us." Without waiting for a response, Arnaud followed the dog, and they drove in the direction he led. The brown dog opened the door gently and hesitantly turned around as soon as Louise got out of the car. Advancing with a quick but silent step, as if he knew exactly where he had to lead them, Louise looked at Arnaud, who sighed but followed in their footsteps. Sounded on the wet cobblestones, they walked through the dark alleys of the city. The more they sank into this labyrinth of narrow alleys, the more tension mounted in Louise's heart. The dog seemed to hesitate to guide the duo precisely, throwing from time to time a look back to make sure they followed well. He slowed down sometimes, patiently waiting, and then accelerated as soon as they were at his height. The air said, "Don't hang around, we don't have time to waste." Louise wondered where everything would lead them, but she felt that there was an urgency in the rhythm from the dog. A silent but pressing Arnaud whispered, "What are we doing here?" Fact, Louise, it was senseless, but a spark of determination shone in her eyes. She answered him, "This dog knows what he's doing." After several minutes of rapid walking, the dog guided them to a less frequented neighborhood, where the buildings seemed old and the streets were even closer. Louise and Arnaud exchanged puzzled looks. These places were far from the neighborhoods they usually patrolled, and the atmosphere was heavy. The windows were obscure, with signs of dusty and closed shops. For a long time, the dog continued without deviating, accelerating by determined moments, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Louise was now feeling an anxiety that settled in her, a mixture of fear and curiosity, wondering what they would find at the end of this path. This dog seemed to know the Rue de la Maze well, as if he had walked it many times before. He ended up stopping in front of an old wooden door, chipped and worn out by time. Pawing at the door, Arnaud hesitantly asked, "Are you sure you want to continue, Louise?" But with a determined smile, she replied, "We've come this far, so we have to see what the dog is trying to show us." She pushed the creaking door open, revealing an unexpected scene. Crossing the threshold, Lise and Arnaud were greeted by darkness and silence, heavy and thick in the air. The smell of something locked and floated, mixed with a more pungent scent. The brown dog entered first, heading without hesitation to a corner of the room. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, the policeman could make out an extended form on an old mattress placed on the ground. Louise approached the beating heart of an elderly lady, Madame Claire. She was breathing weakly, visibly very weak. Her wrinkled face was pale, her milky eyes and skin almost transparently thin. Next to her was a small bowl of empty water that the dog had apparently tried to drink from. To fill the gap, the dog was placed on the ground. He gently lay down next to her, putting his head on her hand, as if conveying a little comfort to Louise. She moved closer, whispering to the dog, who did everything to keep her alive. Arnaud nodded, touched by the scene, while he was pulling out his phone to call for help. While Arnaud composed the emergency number, Louise observed the dog, impressed by his dedication. It was not a simple stray animal. He seemed to be the guardian of Madame Claire, her protector. In the shadows, she realized that despite his neglected appearance, this dog had put his own life in danger to stay by her side, seeking help for this old lady. Obviously, when he felt that her own strength was weakening, the dog felt Louise's gaze. He looked up at her and stared at her, as if to tell him that his mission was accomplished. He was no longer waiting for someone else to take over the responsibility of watching over Madame Claire. Now that she was finally getting help, he could finally rest. Louise felt a mixture of respect and gratitude towards this brave person. She gently laid her hand on his head, thanking him silently for what he had done. Shortly after, the sound of sirens broke the oppressive silence. The dog seemed to relax, as if relieved to have completed his task. When the paramedics arrived and took charge, Madame Claire's dog remained by her side, refusing to move away. Louise, touched by this loyalty, decided to accompany the dog to the ambulance to reassure him. She realized that she could not just leave him behind. She understood that he seemed desperate at the idea of abandoning the one he had protected with so much dedication. At the moment when Madame Claire was being transferred to the ambulance, the dog tried to climb in with her. Louise understood that he not only watched over his mistress out of obligation, but also out of an attachment and a bond that went beyond words. She briefly chatted with the paramedics, begging them to allow the dog to accompany her mistress to the hospital. Finally, seeing the determination of the dog and Louise's determination, the rescuers agreed and the dog immediately jumped into the ambulance. The ambulance arrived and Madame Claire posed her doe one last time. On her way to the hospital, she observed the scene and felt a special warmth invade her, realizing how much this dog had a pure heart and rare loyalty. After Madame Claire arrived at the hospital, Louise stayed with the dog, observing his growing concern as his mistress was taken away for care. She felt a strong empathy for this animal, so attached to the old lady, and a need to protect him. In return, she waited with him for hours in the hall, waiting for the dog to curl up at her feet with their eyes fixed on the door through which Madame Claire disappeared. Observing her calmness and resilience, Louise caught herself thinking about her own past, when she too had felt this loyalty towards those she loved. This dog seemed to be a reflection of what she had always sought to embody: fidelity, determination, and courage. It was then that an idea began to take shape in her mind. To germinate in his mind, if Madame Claire was no longer able to care for him, Louise was ready to offer him a home. She knew that their meeting was not a coincidence and that, despite his modest appearance, this dog had left an indelible impression on his heart. While waiting in the corridor of the hospital, a doctor approached Louise to give her news about Madame Claire. He explained that, despite her advanced age and fragile state of health, she had survived thanks to the constant care provided by the dog. Without him, she probably would not have survived. The doctor spoke in a low, respectful tone, but Louise felt a thrill of emotion run through her. She fully understood the impact this companion had had on Madame Claire's life. The doctor added that, although still weakened, Madame Claire had asked to see the dog as soon as she regained consciousness. She considered him a member of her family. Listening to these words, Louise understood how significant the presence of this dog was for Madame Claire and her family. Their bond was deep and genuine. In the midst of survival and love, Louise was touched by this realization and turned to the dog, who stared at her with eyes full of gentleness and loyalty. At that moment, she knew she would do anything to ensure his well-being, no matter what happened. For Madame Claire, the hours continued to pass as she watched over the dog in the waiting room of the hospital. It was clear that the animal felt a deep concern, and his gaze never left the door through which Madame Claire had disappeared. At times, he would raise his head and stretch out his ear, no doubt hoping for a reassuring sign, something that would confirm his mistress's safety. Louise, sitting by his side, fully felt this expectation, painful as it was. She had already experienced similar situations as a police officer, moments of uncertainty where each minute seemed endless. But today, this expectation took on a more personal dimension, as if she too was waiting for news of her own safety. The dog, who shared the silent anguish, gently put a comforting hand on the animal's head. The dog turned its eyes to the woman, as if to tell her that it understood her support in this shared silence. In this moment, Louise surrendered to the idea that an invisible bond had been woven between them, born of hope and compassion. She knew that, whatever happened, she would stay by the dog's side, ready to offer a fresh start, if necessary. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a nurse approached Louise to inform her that Madame Claire was out of danger. Although she remained weak, she had responded positively to the first care, and her condition was improving. Louise felt a weight lift from her shoulders, and instinctively she passed the news to the dog with a reassuring smile and caress. As if he understood, the dog lifted its tail, manifesting a discreet but sincere relief. The nurse offered to take Louise to Madame Claire's room for a brief moment, knowing how much their bond meant to both of them. It was important for the recovery of the elderly lady, Louise. She moved and accepted without hesitation. She turned to the dog, encouraging her in a gentle manner. "Come to her, waiting for you when you enter the room." Madame Claire opened her eyes weakly and smiled at the sight of her faithful companion, the dog. With infinite gentleness, the dog gently laid its head on the bed next to her hand. Louise observed this scene, feeling the depth of their bond, and promised herself to do everything so that they could stay together, regardless of the future. After the moving visit to Madame Claire's room, Louise began to seriously think about the future of the dog. She had understood how much this animal played an essential role in the life of the old lady, and that their separation would be devastating for both of them. However, she also knew that Madame Claire might no longer be able to take care of it as before due to her fragile health. Therefore, she made a decision to propose adopting the dog. The dog, while allowing Madame Claire to see him on a regular basis, would have a stable home, while maintaining a connection with his owner Louise. He hoped that this arrangement would bring a certain level of comfort to both parties. She approached the nurse, and he explained to Madame Claire that his project was affected by the kindness of Louise, the nurse, and promised to tell her about it as soon as his condition allowed. He felt a surge of hope and believed that this decision was best for ensuring a serene and fulfilling future with the faithful companions. The next day, after resting for a while, Madame Claire was informed about Louise's proposal. At first, a veil of sadness passed over her gaze at the idea of no longer being able to care for her faithful companion as she had before. She knew that, despite her love for him, her declining health would no longer allow her to offer him the care and attention he deserved. However, when she heard that Louise wished to adopt him while allowing him to stay in touch, her face lit up with a small smile. She understood that it was the best solution not only for his well-being but also for the tranquility of her own heart. She took Louise's hand and said, "I understand that this is the best solution for both of us. It will bring peace to both our hearts." Recognition, whispering words of gratitude. "Thank you, I know that with you he will be happy," she says in a weak but sincere voice. Moved, Louise promised him that she would watch over him like a member of her own family. Madame Claire felt reassured, convinced that this new beginning was not only a gift for his dog, but also for herself. A few days after his discharge from Mrs. Claire's hospital, the dog was welcomed into her home, set up in her apartment with all the comforts he deserved. She had arranged a cozy corner for him with a soft cushion and toys, and made sure he always had quality food and fresh water. She decided to call him Remy, a sweet name that suited him perfectly from the first day. Remy adapted to his new environment with amazing ease, although it took him some time to get used to it. He quickly showed signs of trust and affection towards Louise, following her every gesture with loyalty and steadfastness. It seemed as if he understood her, that he had found a home and could now live without fear. Louise was delighted. She saw him flourish and found the spark in her eyes. However, every week she kept an important promise and took Remy to see Madame Claire, for whom this dog remained a companion. Together, they formed a new family united by love and gratitude. Over the weeks, a deep complicity developed between Louise and Remy. Every day, they shared moments of simple joy, long walks and games, where Remy showed his recovered vivacity. There were also quiet moments when he liked to snuggle up by her feet while she was reading or resting after a day's work. Their bond had become so strong that they seemed to understand each other without words. Louise realized that Remy was not just a companion, but a real emotional support. After trying days, she found in him an inexhaustible source of comfort. Serenity greeted her every evening with eyes filled with gratitude, as if he was remembering that she had given him a second chance. Remy seemed to know every detail of his new life, and he made sure to stay close by her side, accompanying him with loyalty and kindness. This unexpected friendship brought Louise inner peace that she had never experienced before, filling a void that she hadn't known existed. 1 year after their meeting, Louise, Remy, and Madame Claire formed a family united by trials and affection. Every week, Louise and Remy would visit Madame Claire, and these moments were filled with laughter and precious memories. May Madame Claire's health continue to be fragile, but the presence of Remy continued to bring her comfort, priceless, and she beamed with happiness at every reunion. For Louise, Rai had transformed her life in a way she could never have imagined. He filled her daily life with love and joy, tenderness, and reminded him of the importance of the little joys. She knew that their meeting was not a chance, but a blessing. In the evening, by tenderly caressing Remy, Louise murmured, "Thank you for choosing me." As a reply, he laid his head on her knee, gently closing his eyes. Together, they knew that they had found love. Sincere and eternal, sealed by loyalty and gratitude. Comment below what you think of this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the next video.